welcome to Drugs Unwrapped with me, Rob. Today I am delighted to be joined by Steph Coronado-Montoya, who is based in Montreal. Steph, how are you? You okay?
Good, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast. It's a very exciting opportunity.
No, you're very welcome. And yeah, thank you for joining us. How is Canada? How is Montreal? Is it cold?
It's yesterday was like I thought it was spring, and then today it's -15, so who knows? Yeah.
-15. Are you serious?
Yeah.
Oh my days. How do you guys get through that?
I don't know. I think it's like an illusion, or like we travel sometimes, or we just no, it's a rough life sometimes. Like yesterday and today specifically.
Yeah, oh crikey. Like in the UK, if there's a tiny bit of snow, everyone battens down the hatches, they don't leave, and yeah, it kind of puts things like that into perspective, I think, in terms of
Yeah.
especially how you guys get through the winter.
Well, and
Absolutely.
I'm from Florida, right? So I'm still not used to it. I'm still confused.
Yeah. Absolutely. So Steph, we actually met, it's nearly a year ago, which I cannot believe at all. So
Yeah.
we actually met in Melbourne, wasn't it, of all places in Australia.
Yeah.
So really, really lucky to go to the Harm Reduction International Conference, which I thought was incredible. It was like 3-4 day conference. It was just something like I'd never experienced before from like an event perspective. But I know it's going back nearly a year ago, but what were your reflections on that event?
I thought it was, as well, for me, like such a different experience to the conferences I usually go to, because the conferences I usually go to are very scientific, very academic, very like poised. And I think the opening remarks are like, drugs are great. And I was like, whoa, we are in a different world here. And it was a lot more activism and people working on the ground, people with lived experience. It was a very, very different audience and a very different perspective that I think is equally valid, but is underrepresented a little bit in the scientific community. So it was very exciting for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of like calls for reform within policy, and I think it just put into perspective what's going on in other countries around like the death penalty associated just possession of drugs, which was quite crazy. Steph, are you able to like just very briefly explain who you are, and obviously you're currently undertaking a PhD, nearly you're at the end stages, so yeah, just briefly explain around what your research is all about as well.
Yeah, so I am doing my PhD specializing in cannabis use harm reduction programs for people with psychosis. Before that, I was working in mindfulness a bit, basically a lot of psychology and psychiatry research in the past, and all of it benefiting vulnerable populations. So in this case, it's young people who have psychosis.
So why cannabis? Like what, and specifically why around like psychosis then? What kind of drew you to that bit of research?
It was actually a bit of a coincidence, because I was actually at that point looking to go back to the States to look for more PhD opportunities for psychology kind of research programs. And I got a job at this lab who was doing really interesting work. And right then they legalized cannabis. So there was an opening for many researchers to come in and do this kind of work. And I got offered to do the PhD there, benefiting vulnerable populations through mental health research, which is what I aim to do. So I just took a really good chance. I knew very little about drugs and never really imagined myself in this world, but I've been loving it.
No way. So you didn't have any experience around kind of like working
None.
in the field or anything like
I used to work as a counselor for vulnerable women. And so there we did see people who were homeless and who had been using substances. And on the field, what we saw was a lot of like harm reduction approaches. And that was the first time I was exposed to a different approach. Before that, I had always heard, oh, drugs are bad, abstinence, abstinence, abstinence. And then I saw that in practice, people could be more flexible and it could bring about very interesting outcomes. So that's why this specific type of project actually interested me a lot.
So in terms of from your like research then, has it kind of gone to plan? Like I've known, and I do know people who've done PhDs, and they are, yeah, depending on the time of their PhD, depends upon how well they're doing. Very stressed most of the time. But no, in terms of, has it kind of gone how you expected, and ultimately, what have you found from your research as a whole?
So I went in knowing I wanted to do a harm reduction based program for this population. I think one piece that wasn't necessarily something that we were expecting was the fact that there would be such little evidence to support our projects, which meant we had to build a lot of the evidence ourselves. So it was meant to be, my PhD was meant to be the development of an intervention, of a harm reduction intervention. So first we did a systematic review to see everything that was done, what worked, what didn't, to use this to build our intervention. But very quickly, when we saw that there were only 5 interventions that had been done to address this, we were like, okay, well, that's not enough evidence. We need more. So we had to create a survey of people, of preferences, of people with psychosis to kind of guide the intervention. So that took like an additional 3 years. So that was a major study and so this was what helped inform the intervention, that the program basically that we created. But yeah, because it's such a new field, that was one thing I was not expecting, was to have to generate so much evidence to get to the point of actually building the program.
Wow. Okay. So there really wasn't much available for specifically for people with psychosis that use cannabis?
Yeah, and harm reduction approaches. There isn't much in that. Because a lot of what exists right now are very like abstinence focused, and even then we don't know what actually works. Like we don't have one specific approach or program that, that helps people with their cannabis use across the board. We don't have this yet. So even in the related literature, we're struggling to find enough evidence. That's why we decided to create additional studies.
You wrote an article for us before Christmas, wasn't it? And I think, you can find that kind of on our website under Drugs Unwrapped. But kind of what I got from that in terms of from Canada's perspective, there seems to be, I may have got the perception wrong, but quite a big emphasis on abstinence, and actually harm reduction may be playing second fiddle a little bit. Would that be correct in kind of saying that?
Yeah, and much like with any problematic substance use, it makes sense that abstinence is like the first go-to, just theoretically, because especially in people with psychosis, just in the sense that your risk of having harms related to your cannabis use goes way down if you stop using cannabis. But the reality is that people who are using cannabis may not want to or are not ready to. So we don't have like more realistic, more flexible interventions that meet people where they're at in their desires, So this is why there's a push for harm reduction, why there's a necessity for it. But yeah, the classical view is more of abstinence.
So talk to me then in terms of your intervention then yourself. So what is it that you've kind of developed, and have you seen any kind of positive kind of outcomes come from that so far?
Yeah, so as I said, we had to do like an intermediary project where we were surveying preferences, and so we use these preferences to actually build our program. So for example, the preferences were that people wanted it to be short. They wanted it to not last too long in terms of the sessions. They wanted it to be technology based. They wanted it to use certain approaches. And this is what we did with our program. We did a brief technology based. It's delivered through an app, psychosocial program for people with psychosis that targeted harm reduction for cannabis. And so we've developed it, and we're actually analyzing the results right now. So I would not be able to divulge these beautiful secrets just yet. But I can tell you that, like, anecdotally, both with the patient partners that we've worked with and the clinicians, we've had a lot of positive feedback. We've had a lot of feedback in terms of we've been needing something like this for a long time. This is coming from the clinician's perspective, and from patient partners who are saying, or people with lived experience, who are saying, like, I wish I had had this when I had first gone through my first episode of psychosis. I didn't know this, I didn't know that. And this really like frames it in a way that I can understand. So anecdotally, we've seen a lot of positive feedback, and we're analyzing the results. So we'll see in a few months.
Okay, so it's kind of like waiting with bated breath a little bit in terms of what you potentially are going to find out. Did you look at like a specific age range or specific kind of gender, or was it kind of a very broad kind of criteria in terms of people that took part in your study?
Yeah, we kept it broad, so we didn't specify the kind of psychosis. Like, for example, there could be different psychotic disorders, like substance-induced psychosis, or they could have a bipolar disorder with psychotic features. So we kept it broad in that sense. As long as they were experienced psychosis, experiencing psychosis and they were going to an early intervention services clinic, which is essentially for people who have psychosis, as long as they had recently used cannabis and wanted to improve their practices, so basically reduce their harms, and they were 18 to 35. So it's pretty broad criteria.
In terms of like psychosis then, so my knowledge around like psychosis and various like mental health kind of issues is I'm not going to lie, Steph, isn't great. I can do with learning a lot more about it, if I'm brutally honest with you. So what are we talking about then in terms of psychosis? I know you kind of touched upon there a little bit in terms of the different kind of aspects of it, but why, what are we talking about in relation to psychosis, and why is there such a relationship then between psychosis and cannabis?
Well, so psychosis is, first off, it's a condition and it's not like a disorder. So it's a condition that pertains to many different mental health disorders, like including bipolar disorder or a psychotic disorder. And basically it's like when a person's experiencing a break from reality for an extended period of time. So that means they're either not able to differentiate what are real voices and what are voices inside their head. They're seeing things that other people aren't seeing, and it can come with other symptoms. In terms of why it's relevant to cannabis use is that we see that there's definitely an association. There's something happening between cannabis use and psychosis, that they seem to be interlinked somehow. So, for example, we see that people who have psychosis who use cannabis versus those who don't tend to have more like worsened symptoms, more severe, more frequent worsened symptoms. So they tend to have longer hospitalizations, more relapses in terms of their episodes, and more suicidal ideation, a lot of things that we don't really want. And the inverse is also true, whereas, so we see that people who use cannabis more frequently, or they started at an early age, tend to have higher risk of developing a psychotic episode. So we see that there's something there for sure, and both of them are related to negative consequences. So this is why we want to address this.
Sure, yeah. Why did, I'm being devil's advocate here, right? But like, if people are experiencing, or people with psychosis have a higher chance of experiencing negative effects from their cannabis use, is there kind of anything that could be discussed there in terms of then why do they go and use cannabis if they are potentially then going to experience more negative effects, if you get my, if say for example, you know, their psychotic episodes are going to be worsened by it, or just generally their quality of life is going to be more negative. So why, from your perspective, do people continue to use cannabis?
I think that there's a big lack of education around the effects of that cannabis can have to a person who's already like predisposed to having a psychotic episode, or to a random person. For example, if you start using at 15 years old and very frequently or very potent, you have a higher risk of developing a psychotic episode. And there's not that much information that's spread around about this. So there's like this little piece of education that's missing. One thing that is worth mentioning is that when people go into treatment for their psychosis, for people who are using cannabis, there does tend to be, I think it's at least 1/3 of people who will stop using cannabis because they finally understand the link. And so they'll stop immediately. They'll just go cold turkey on that. But there is still this 2/3 that continue to use for different reasons, whether it's because their social network continues to use them, so it's kind of dependent on that, or because out of habit, for example, out of boredom, like those things do happen. And also, again, that I think that lack of education on this piece.
Yeah, I find cannabis it's such a complex drug. Like, there's so many different varieties of cannabis. Like, I get so confused, do you know? Yeah. And like, obviously, you know, talking specifically about the drug itself, you know, you got the different kind of, first of all, you got different plants that you can grow. Then obviously you've just got the different varieties. You got different cannabinoids, of which, you know, THC and CBD are kind of like the most well-known ones. And then you kind of got all the different versions of cannabis, and I think the market's ever growing now, isn't it, in terms of like different cannabis oils, and so moving away from that kind of traditional kind of bud perspective. So but yeah, in terms of like what you discussed there, it's kind of linked with mental health, because I don't know whether it's the same kind of what you experience in terms of over in Canada, but like there's, whenever we talk about cannabis here, mental health always is in the same conversation as cannabis. There's kind of, it's very rarely kind of discussed separately to a degree, or at least when cannabis is mentioned, mental health is always kind of in the background, without a doubt. Do you tend to find, in terms of, and maybe kind of what you came across within your research, that those that are potentially predisposed to kind of the psychotic conditions and experience psychosis, that there were environmental factors that played a part in terms of them being more susceptible to it? So we kind of, whether it's even down to genders or poverty, for example, did you find that there was a correlation in terms of that potential susceptibility?
Yeah. So I think if like all conditions were exactly the same, the number of people who would experience a psychotic episode would stay at 1 to 3%, but your chances of experiencing a psychotic episode go higher, like increase, if, for example, you do experience a lot of childhood trauma, or you have a family history of somebody who has a psychotic disorder, or lower socioeconomic status does tend to play into that because of possible traumas or adversity that you can experience. The cannabis use, as I mentioned before, early use of cannabis, so at an early age, all of these things can increase your risk of developing a psychotic episode.
So yeah, there's loads of factors at play that could play
100%,
a massive part in that. So obviously you're kind of the app that you kind of developed, the digital interventions. Do you see that playing a much bigger kind of role moving forwards, in terms of just purely based from an accessibility perspective? So if people, for example, are able to access interventions via an app, obviously it's a lot more accessible than going to like your treatment center, for example, and doing it face to face. Do you see actually what you have kind of like developed kind of being the starting point of like a new dynamic in terms of like interventions and treatment moving forward?
My very optimistic brain wants to say yes, but there is like a lot of positive intervention effects that we see, especially in in-person interventions, is the therapeutic alliance. So with an app, unfortunately, you can't really have this therapeutic alliance. So for example, our Champs app, that's the name of the app we developed, is actually in combination with early intervention services. So we're not trying to replace it. We're trying to add one more tool to take away from clinician workload, and to address cannabis use in a very non-stigmatizing, harm reduction based approach. So I don't know that this kind of app will necessarily ever live on its own. I think this kind of work will always have to be in conjunction with existing mental health services specialized for people with psychosis, but it definitely has the potential to help, because there are a lot of clinicians who don't feel like they have the adequate resources or training to talk about substance use specifically, because they've been trained in, let's say, more in terms of psychotic disorders, right? So I think it can help, but I'm not sure that it will necessarily replace in-person programs. I do have to add that it is very exciting to see so many apps coming into play and everything, but what we do need still is people who are evaluating this in a very rigorous way. How do we know that a well-intentioned app is really helping the way it's intended to, or is it creating distress, or does it lack research? For example, that's something that's been seen in certain apps where, let's say it's for depression and somebody has a suicidal idea, but there's no resource to get them in touch with a mental health service provider. And so it ends up leaving people more distressed in a very critical moment. So there are things that still need to be worked out. We need to evaluate them rigorously, but there's definitely an interesting potential, I think, for apps.
Absolutely. Do you know, going back, I was going to ask you actually, and I forgot to ask you, but do you know, in terms of people who experience psychosis, what do they tend to provide kind of common answers when you ask in terms of what they get from their cannabis use? Do they see that it supports, you know, their psychosis in some way? Do they kind of provide any kind of answers around that, or what was the general feeling really in terms of when you kind of ask in terms of what they get from their cannabis use?
Yeah, so a lot of people who, and this is not, for example, research that I've conducted, this is related research, but a lot of people with psychosis who use cannabis started using for the same reasons that people in the general population did. So out of boredom, or their friends offered it, or out of curiosity, or just to get high, like very, very common reasons. And then why they continue using it, especially once they know that it can cause harm, why they've continued using it. There's a very high rate of cannabis use disorder in people with psychosis. So it's like 40% of people, 30 to 40% of people going into services for a psychotic episode have a cannabis use disorder. So a lot of it can be due to the dependence of it. Others, like I said, is social network related, or out of boredom. This is their activity to do, for instance, like a lot of the same reasons that we see in the general population. There is like a lot of speculation, or there used to be, about people with psychosis who use cannabis doing it to self-medicate their symptoms. So this is something that we've heard a lot, and we've looked into it, and not me specifically, like other related research. And what we found is that while this is true for a tiny minority of the population of people with psychosis, it's not for the majority. Again, it's for the same reasons as we see in other people with other mental health disorders in the general population.
Yeah, that's something I was going to ask in terms of like self-medicating around it. Absolutely, because we hear that quite a lot, you know, in terms of, especially like around like schizophrenia, that like, as we've already mentioned, potentially cannabis can exacerbate those things associated to schizophrenia, but actually people who experience schizophrenia use cannabis because also it helps alleviate various things as well. So it's kind of a little bit of a catch-22 from that perspective. So how is the cannabis legal market going in Canada? Because it was, I want to say, was it 2018 when it kind of got implemented? So we're actually looking like nearly 6 years now, isn't it, since it actually started. So from your perspective, were you initially in support of it and reflecting of what you know and what you've seen, just as somebody who resides in Canada? Do you feel that it's been a positive move?
Yeah, definitely. Like personally, in my opinion. So again, I come from the States, right? Where I find a lot more restrictive in that sense, or at least when I was living there in Florida, it was very, very different. I remember when I first moved to Montreal and everybody was smoking weed, and the cops would pass by and nobody would say anything. And I knew it was illegal at that time, and I was so confused. And then I understood that it was very tolerated, even though it wasn't legal. So at least in Montreal, it's very tolerated before legalization. Once they legalized it, it was no longer so problematic. And I think it's actually been very interesting, like from a public health perspective, I think it's very interesting because we can actually start developing programs that are evidence-based to help people who need help. We can open up conversations about cannabis in a way that's not stigmatizing and doesn't land people in jail. So I think there are many ways in which I find this is beneficial. For example, people can buy products of higher quality now. You know, like they have a more regulated system now. So there are definitely advantages to it. That's not to say it doesn't come without disadvantages. There have been disadvantages in certain senses. There are things that can be better, but I do think globally the legalization was a great move.
So in terms of from the legal cannabis market then, does anybody want to go back to how it was? Or is it kind of a case that, like, even from the Canadian government perspective, that they are like, yes, this is something that we will continue?
I don't think, I can't think of a single person who's ever said those words to me, like, I want to go back to when cannabis was not legalized. I don't think anybody would want it. Maybe I was talking to a colleague about this the other day. Maybe like the dealers, because now they have more competition. But besides that, no, I think, again, given at least in Montreal, it was so tolerated already. Now it's just opened up doors to like different conversations, like it's opened up doors to better quality products. I think people are generally satisfied. Every province does it differently too. So maybe in that sense, some people are like, oh, I wish we were, for example, in Quebec, it's pretty strict in terms of the regulations compared to other provinces. So maybe in that sense, they'd be like, oh yeah, I wish we provided more of a variety of products, for example. But no, I think globally, and of course I'm biased because I'm working in cannabis, so a lot of my entourage is more, I would say, open-minded about this. But even then, like, no, I think people are pretty happy with this move.
So when you say it's more strict in Quebec, is it strict in terms of like what you said, that there is a lack of variety of products available compared to, say, another province, or is it kind of strict in other ways?
No, it's it's on different restrictions. For example, in Ontario, you can grow up to 4 plants at home. In Quebec, you cannot grow any plants. In Ontario, you can get weed at 18 years old, whereas in Quebec, you have to be 21. So there's like different distinctions, the variety of products. I think, if I'm not mistaken, edibles are still not allowed in Quebec, whereas in Ontario, yes. So it's different kinds of restrictions that definitely set us aside from a lot of other provinces.
It sounds a little bit then similar in terms of what is like in the States, in the United States, in terms of within individual states, that obviously they have their own, their own different kind of like laws around it, in terms of how they go about the kind of legalization of it. Obviously, the states that have implemented that.
Yeah, I think this is how it's done in the States. I could be wrong, but one thing that I'm very glad personally that is not being done in Canada is like commercializing weed. So I think this is where we would get into super tricky territory. The way alcohol has been commercialized, it's if we were to do that to weed, I think it could be problematic given the lack of education we have about the risks associated to cannabis use. Like, granted, not everybody who uses weed will have harms, but there is a risk, and there are risks for certain groups. And I think if we start commercializing and not educating the population about the risks, then it would become a much more difficult issue.
Have services, like treatment services, seen an increase in the amount of people accessing their provision for cannabis use since the legalization? Is that something that has occurred? If you know. I realize you don't work with
exact stats on this. I do think I've seen a few studies that report like an increase in the access to treatments, but there's still, I would say, the majority of people who have a cannabis use disorder and will not go to treatment.
I guess even if there is a little bit of an increase, it could come along the lines of that actually cannabis use is just more open now alongside the legalization. So actually more people it's just a coincidence in that, people are potentially increasing, or should I say there's an increase in people accessing services, not necessarily due to the legalization, but because actually it's no longer such a taboo. Not that I would say there's as much taboo associated to cannabis compared to other drugs, but obviously even when it was illegal, obviously there's still a taboo aspect to it, which I guess has been alleviated.
There's still stigma around weed use and everything. Like, you see it at different levels. You see it at the government level, you see it at the treatment services level, you see it in the population. There is still stigma associated to weed use, unfortunately. So that is one of the things that is interesting to look at in these studies is, okay, are people accessing treatments because more people are using cannabis after the legalization, which is true, more people are using cannabis after the legalization, or is it because it's finally legal, so there's less stigma around it? So that would be interesting to look at.
Do you know, you mentioned disadvantages. Are there any disadvantages that come to mind in terms of around the legal model?
So for example, some advantages, concrete advantages would be, for example, there's been decreases in the number of arrests in the population due to cannabis. But some of the disadvantages include higher hospitalizations due to cannabis poisoning, including in, I just posted about this on my Instagram today, but there's been a higher number of hospitalizations of children ages 0 to 9 due to cannabis poisoning since legalization. You know, so these are like concrete, I think, disadvantages. It's something that can be addressed with enough education, I think, and enough prevention, you know, because I do think in terms of the population, we're doing a big favor by legalizing, because we can actually help protect so many different groups of people with this. But yeah, these are some of the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see in terms of Canada as a whole moving more towards other regulated models for other drugs? Is that something that's being discussed, or even the likes of decriminalization around the possession of other drugs? Is that something that, where there's being kind of muted in Canada, or is being actively discussed? Is that something you see happening in the future?
Yeah, there has been talks. I can't remember which province exactly, but that had been decriminalizing holding or possessing a certain amount of a drug. And given the very harm reduction oriented approach, like public health perspective that Canada has had in the past, you know, like we've been pioneers amongst the other countries in a lot of these harm reduction approaches. Yeah, I could see that happening in the next few years, but policy tends to move slowly, so we'll see. I wouldn't be shocked though if that were to happen.
Policy does take a little while
Yeah.
to come into fruition when definitely when it's being first kind of talked about. Steph, you did a shameless plug there of your Insta. That didn't go unnoticed, believe me. But no, I think I said to you before we started recording, I think actually your Insta account is probably one of my favorites, because in terms of, you know, you obviously come from an academic background, but you know, and you're kind of in the thick of it really from an academia perspective, obviously specific to cannabis and kind of psychosis in particular. But I think also you kind of look at other kind of topics similar to that, and why I like it is you actually put academic language into everyday language that's easy to understand for, especially for people like myself, you know, like I look at academic kind of research and stuff and I'd love to understand it, but I'm just like, I'm none the wiser come the end of it.
Oh, no.
But no. So how did that come about? Because you're pretty active on there, I'm not going to lie, you know, and being somebody who runs like Barod's social media account, it's a full-time job sometimes, to be honest with you, in terms of social media. So how did it come about? Why running that Insta kind of profile? Why is that important to you?
When I first started my PhD, I didn't know much about weed. Started telling people, hey, I'm doing a PhD in weed research and stuff. All of these like misconceptions came at me from different sources. Like they would tell me, oh yeah, did you know that CBD causes cancer? You should look into that. Did you know that CBD helps with sleep? You should look into that. Weed helps with insomnia. You should. And I did look into it and I was like, I don't think that's true, you know. And I would do this one by one. Like people would have conversations with me just in the street, at a party, with friends, whatever. And I would go and like try to deconstruct a lot of these things based on the evidence I had seen. But then like, I just became really aware of how much misinformation existed. And there was like this, I really wanted to go on a larger platform. And I'm not like, contrary to popular belief, I'm not a fan of selfies or the camera or social media or any of these things. But I did know that I needed a larger platform. Like, you know, I wanted to start telling people about what we knew, because as scientists, we have access to so much knowledge that could actually help people in so many ways. But kind of as you said, like it's in such technical jargon that we're not giving people access to this knowledge, and it's knowledge that would really benefit them. So that's why I started it, because I really wanted to kind of share the information we knew and be like, hey guys, by the way, this is what we actually know, and this is what we don't know, and this is what we believe, and this is the work that's being done. So that was a big reason which motivated me to start the Brain Diaries, and also to kind of just like increase representation of a PhD student, a Latina PhD student, a mom who's a PhD student, you know, a woman who's a PhD. All of these things were things that I was like, I want people to see people like them doing this kind of research. So
yeah, I'm sure you've inspired, you know, other people to kind of not only go into the kind of field and do similar stuff, but, you know, similar stuff from a kind of social media, because I think that's where a lot of people get their information now, isn't it? Without a doubt. Have you? Are you on TikTok? Have you tried TikTok, Steph?
No, I'm much like you.
Oh.
No, I'm overwhelmed by just Instagram, and like, again, I'm a mom, I'm doing my PhD, like I already have enough on my plate, and Instagram does take time too. So I'm just like, listen, I may not reach all of the youngins, but I'm doing my best on Instagram.
Yeah, I advise you to stay away from TikTok. That is a mad place. It's absolutely, and it's crazy on there. I don't know what's going on half the time, if I'm brutally honest with you.
Oh no.
But yeah, but no. So your Insta handle, what's your Insta handle if people want to follow you, and very much advise people to do that?
It's the Brain Diaries. So the _brain diaries.
There we are, fab. I'll put it in the description as well. So so when people kind of read the description, they can click on that and follow you, and definitely check out your stories as well, because you put a lot of content on your stories and not just your feed from there as well with it. But yeah, I think cannabis itself, you know, there's so much. I think you mentioned it when we were kind of like catching up around doing this kind of episode. I think your the way that you said it is fake news. There's lots of fake news, and you mentioned it there in terms of when you're talking about your app, you know, like CBD causes cancer and stuff, and I don't know any other drug that has so many myths really from it. So I know you kind of like touched upon it, but how is it tough, would you say, in terms of trying to dispel those myths, you know, and do you find that not just yourself, but people that you work with and kind of liaise with within this field are constantly being bombarded by kind of those myths and that fake news around cannabis? And again, you know, I can assume that it takes a lot of time really to constantly keep dispelling those and actually get that education out there. How important is it to you in terms of that people actually have that right information, and that actually, when that fake news does come around, that is very quickly dispelled?
Definitely very important to me that we counter fake news. This is why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. This is why I'm still doing it. Like, I do this work for free and in my free time, and it's just it's because I think it's extremely important that people know this. Like, before, I kind of mentioned it before, but I used to do research on mindfulness-based therapies. And this was in 2015 when it was all the hype. And it was at that time a lot of people were thinking, oh, mindfulness can cure this and that and that and that. And while I don't discourage people to try alternative therapies for problems that are not like responding to traditional therapies, I would hate it if I heard that somebody who really needed a treatment decides to go for something that has no evidence to support it versus something, for example, they have cancer and they need chemo, but decide to go for mindfulness because they have heard that mindfulness can help, whereas chemo actually has evidence to support it. This is why like countering fake news is so important to me, because there are like concrete damages to it. Like I heard, for example, somebody told me, oh, I've heard that weed can help with Parkinson's. I should start taking that, right? And I was like, no, you should not actually, because Parkinson's is a neurological disorder. Weed can exacerbate this. Like, no, dude, this is where fake news becomes harmful. So it's definitely, I think, very important. And I actually just read a study on this, on fake news and real news. And they did a study from, I think they were looking at tweets from 2005 to 2016, and they were looking at the rate of sharing of fake news versus real news. And unfortunately, what they found was that fake news was being spread so much more quickly than real news, and it was causing, like, evoking all these emotions of like shock or surprise and everything, but it was spread much more quickly than real news. So I think this is where scientists need to come in and really like start speaking out with the evidence that we have and try to like counter that as much as we can, essentially.
And obviously you mentioned earlier on, in conversation with the legal cannabis market, education is a big thing as well, isn't it? Getting that information out there.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I think, what you're doing in terms of your Insta and knowing in terms of working with colleagues who work in young person services, Insta and TikTok is kind of the places where they're at now,
Yeah.
So being able to provide that information as you do on your Insta account, I think probably is going to get to a lot more people than maybe more traditional routes, which is fab.
And there's actually been like studies on that where they were looking at young people and asking them, where are your sources of information for cannabis, for different substances? And many of them reported that the sources they relied on, rather than high school education, for instance, this is like very young people, adolescents, was mainly TikTok and other social media channels. There are studies showing that people are going to these sources for information, but I don't know that many. I'm in the science communication community a little bit. There's not that many people who are academics who are doing this kind of work, unfortunately. Like, we need more of this for sure, because that's where people are getting their information. They're not reading the JAMA articles, they're not reading BMJ, which makes sense because it's not readable anyway, or at least for people who don't speak science, essentially. But yeah, so definitely, I think it's important work that needs to be done more.
No, I take my hat off to you, being able to kind of do that as well as do your PhD and be a parent and just generally live your life as well. No, fair play to you. I don't know how you find the time. Absolutely. Steph, is there anything else you'd like to, before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to mention at all?
I think there's a new branch of research that is starting to happen more and more, and I think I'd want to mention this because more and more in all kinds of research, we're doing participatory-based approaches, which is essentially including people with lived experience into our research design and into our research studies, because people with lived experience have so much expertise in their lived experience. And so I'm saying this more in the sense of, like, if there's someone out there who's listening to this podcast and has lived experience, consider becoming involved in research projects, because your expertise can count as much as a researcher. We may have like theoretical knowledge to a certain extent, but a lived experience counts for so much. And we're starting to do this more and more, like in my studies, that's been an important component of it, and other studies too. So I think that's a really cool branch that's coming out more and more and valuing really what is lived experience.
Yeah, it's huge, isn't it? And it's so important to kind of in all aspects. And it's great to hear in terms of from kind of an academic and research perspective that lived experience is definitely on the radar, without a doubt. Yeah. Steph, the rest of 2014, I know we're only in February, but what's it looking like for you? Have you got any big plans at all?
2024.
What did I say? 2014?
Yeah.
I'm still living in the past now. I was full of youth and hair and all sorts in 2014. So
2014 was a fun year. It was fun.
It was a great year, yeah. But no, 2024. What's 2024 looking like for you then?
Well, this year I'll finally be graduating with my PhD, which is very exciting. My family is looking forward to calling me Dr. Nena, which means Dr. Baby Girl, which is very odd, but listen, that's what they want to call me. So I'm very excited to graduate with my PhD, and then start doing research as a postdoctoral fellow. Yeah.
Awesome. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Steph, thank you so much for taking the time out. I know you're incredibly busy and time is very precious, and it wasn't too early in the morning for you. I think it's like 10 or 11 o'clock for you,
Thank you
isn't
for
it?
that.
So
I'm not the same person when it's early.
yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, good luck with everything that you do, and fingers crossed for you in terms of the end of your PhD and everything goes all right for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's been a pleasure for me too.
No worries. Thank you, Steph. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you have been affected by any of the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out. Barod have a free and confidential live web chat service that is available 7 days a week on our website at barod.cymru, where you can chat to a trained support worker. Alternatively, you can contact Wales's National Drug and Alcohol Helpline Dan 24/7, either by calling 0808 808 2234 or text Dan to 81066.